Hi, everyone. I'm Brian Kulick. I'm the chair of the theater program. And on behalf of the theater program and the Zuckerman Institute and the folks at Lenfest, I want to extend a big, warm welcome to you all to be here for this afternoon, where ideas come from, art, science, and memory. I almost forgot the title of this. It's so embarrassing. It's about memory, and I almost forgot. It's an extraordinary group of people you're going to hear from today. We have Sarah Ruhl, extraordinary playwright, who I don't even know where to begin to start to talk about this. Sarah, over 2 decades, has amassed this extraordinary body of work, which is just astonishing. And I think she is clearly one of our great American playwrights, contemporary playwrights working right now. So it's a real joy to have her here. And you know her plays. It's like Eurydice and Clean House and Stage Kiss, and it just goes on and on and on in the next room. And you know, Eurydice, they made it into an opera. You know you've hit a certain kind of thing when your play gets turned into an opera, for goodness sakes. Joining Sarah will be Carol Becker, extraordinary professor here, but also Dean Emerita of the School of the Arts. School of the Arts was a very promising place, and then Carol came, and she, over the period of time that she's been with us, has turned it into a real force. Now Sarah Cole is with us. And this, I think this room, this building wouldn't be here if it wasn't for Carol, so we have that. And also, if you don't know, Carol is an extraordinary writer in her own right. She has 2 amazing books, Losing Helen and I was going to say Gerald. I'm forgetting, this thing is about memory and I'm just panicked. I'm going to keep forgetting every single thing. So it's Gerald's. No, George. I'm almost done, I promise. And then rounding this out is Daphna Shohamy, who is the director of the Zuckerman Institute of Neuroscience, whose writing you'll find in Nature and Neuroscience and all of these amazing places. Her work is on learning and memory, and that's really what we're here about today, that these 3 extraordinary individuals, they all rhyme and traffic in the art of memory. And their works linger when you read them. They are genuinely memorable. And I think we are in store for a very memorable afternoon. I have some housekeeping things that I've been told I have to tell you. Okay, when you came in, did they give you papers and pencils? Okay, during the course of this afternoon, if you feel the urge to write a question, write a question. Then at a certain point, people will collect those questions. They'll be given to Carol, and she will ask them. So there's that. Also, books. There are books over there. There will be a signing of Sarah's books, 3 extraordinary books. There's Eurydice, that's the one that got turned into the opera. There's Smile, amazing autobiographical book. And my personal favorite, Lessons from My Teachers, which is a gorgeous book of essays. Okay, last thing, and I'm done. I'm out of here, mic drop, is you're now going to see a clip from Eurydice, the opera I was telling you about. And then you'll hear from these amazing folks. Thank you so much.
I think my husband was with me. What was my husband's name? My husband's name? Do you know it? Oh, strange. I don't remember. It was to see his face. died. His eyes were two black birds, and they flew to me. I said, no, stay where you are. He needs you. I forget. They took me to a tiny boat. I only just fit inside. I looked at the oars. I looked at the oars, and I wanted to
Hi, thanks for having me. It's always amazing for me to see Erin Morley in that clip. And I'm going to read an essay in progress I've been working on that's about Eurydice, but it's about the play version that I worked on at Signature Theater last year, an experience I had going on for one of the Stones when the Stone had COVID. Just to explain, the Stones are sort of the Greek chorus. They were the gray beings sort of in the background. So I'll just read you a little excerpt from it before we all talk. It's called The Fourth Wall and the Body. The fourth wall is an invisible wall in the theater separating actors from audiences so that the viewer can peer at the proscenium and imagine they're seeing life taking place. It was not always so. Diderot coined the term in the 18th century, hoping to get away from fusty presentational French dramas, hoping the new viewer would see life itself on the stage. I had a dream recently of a theater teacher of mine, Joyce Piven, who died a year ago. In the dream, Joyce said, "I know now, after death, that nothing is separate, that it's all going on all the time, and the body is like what we call the fourth wall in theater, a necessary illusion for some." I was gobsmacked. Last year, I was working at Signature Theater in New York City when the director, Les Waters, was putting up my play, Eurydice. We had opened, the play was running, and the artistic director called me on a Sunday to say one of the Stones had COVID. That particular Stone in question had no understudy, we were sold out, and there was a matinee that afternoon. Canceling was not an option. We discussed various solutions. Could the two other Stones read in for the third? Could the stage manager? We decided the best course of action was for me to come in and play Loud Stone myself. I'm not particularly loud, but I knew all the lines. I arrived at Signature Theatre and had my makeup done to match the other stones. They had a 19th century clown thing going on. I admired myself in the mirror with my blue eyeshadow. I didn't put on a full costume. I didn't want the audience to think I was actually going to be Loudstone since I hadn't rehearsed the role. I positioned myself on stage in a chair with the script on a music stand at the lip of the stage, where, in a realistic play, the fourth wall stretches invisibly across the proscenium. The two other stones sat beside me in full costume and makeup. We rehearsed, they put me at ease, they helped me by taking a deep breath before we spoke in unison. I tried to breathe with them. We had all decided I would read from the text rather than from memory in case I forgot anything. The audience came and the play began. I was in an odd suspended state. I was both of the actors and of the audience, who I could see dimly. I was performing, but not performing. I knew the lines because I'd written them, but I did not know the lines in my body because I had not rehearsed them. I was sitting smack in the middle of the fourth wall, the place of illusion that separates audience from actors, and I was ecstatically disoriented. I looked into the face of Maya Hawke, who was playing Eurydice. I could see emotion passing across her face, transparent and up close. I could feel that I was one with the stones when I spoke with them, but I was separate. There was a separation between the actors who were truly embodying the text and the writer who had written it. Ah, I thought, memory is necessary for the actor's embodiment. It is not enough to think it and say it. I was only voicing the stone, but I was not playing the stone. I tried to blend my voice in, come in on time, and that was the best I could do. I dared not move. Learning to act is learning to move. Learning to write is learning to sit still. I looked out at the audience. I thought I saw my first love in the fourth row. Was it possible? Had he grown a beard? The play was about him, Jesus Christ. I read my lines from the page and tried not to freak out. Where was I? I was not an actor. I could not enter their world, but I had made the world they were inhabiting. There are so many illusions that we shed in the course of our lifetime. Is the body the last remaining one? And is theater good practice for that shedding? There's a concept in meditation of erasing the boundary between subject and object. In a way, it's a mental loosening of the fourth wall. When we insist on a total coherence of fake reality behind the proscenium, a looker and a looked at, the space between does not get addressed or crossed over. The fourth wall is a dream space, an in-between space, a thin place. A soliloquy bridges that gap, as does music or a Greek chorus or a clown who makes eye contact with the audience. 40 days after Joyce dies, I dream she's alive again. In the dream, she hugs me, and I tell her that all the lessons she gave me have been absorbed into my work. I will never be an actor. Seeing actors do that work up close while I was on stage with them was a reminder, if I ever needed one, of how brave, generous, mercurial, and vulnerable they are, how magical, how willing they are to go to a heightened space, with only the fourth wall to protect them when they need it. They have the power to remember to forget the audience when they must, and then they let them in. And when they do, whoosh, the fourth wall opens and shines, and somewhere the sound of a bell. Thank you.
Space and memory are the topic of our conversation today, and this beautiful bird you're looking at on the screen knows a lot about space and memory. This is a black-capped chickadee, and this is a photograph taken by my colleague Dmitry Aronov, who's trying to understand something about one of the most extraordinary accomplishments of this black-capped chickadee, which is its extraordinary spatial memory. The black-capped chickadee hides up to 5,000 food items a day in the wilderness, and then goes and finds them where he left them, or she left them, as the case may be, and does this remarkably successfully, which we know from a lot of research. So how does that happen? Just think of that. In the wilderness, trees that look pretty much the same to us, this bird has not only access to sort of visual cues to encode, but the brain is able to create a trace in a moment, in a brief moment that it can hold on to for, we think, as long as a month, and be able to use that trace to go and find those food items later. The black-capped chickadee is not the only one who can create long-term traces of memory in their brain. This is a photo I took in Lima, Peru, a couple weeks ago when I was on a trip there, and it was at a really gorgeous food market. And I remember the mango I had from this food market, and I could easily find my way back to it. But I remember not just where the mango was, even though I had been there exactly once. I also remember much more than that, as we do. I remember where I came from and how I felt and where I was going. I remember the layout of this part of the food market, and if you dropped me there, I could navigate there, and I could even describe to you now, even though there's nothing in the sensory world to indicate any of the information. Somewhere in my mind, I know enough to tell you about the rest of my day from this starting point. So we have these memories, we refer to them in neuroscience as episodic memories, that have this richness of a particular moment in time and have this extra information about space and also about time and about relative space and relative time. We can experience something once and hold on to a memory for days, weeks, months, and as we all know, much longer than that too. The ability to create episodic memories depends entirely on one particular really remarkable structure in the brain that's on the screen now, and that's the hippocampus. What you're seeing here is an image from functional magnetic resonance imaging showing activity in the hippocampus on both sides. The hippocampus is a seahorse-shaped structure right behind the ears. In fact, that's where the name hippocampus comes from. And we discovered in the 50s that if the hippocampus is removed, a person is no longer able to create these kind of episodic memories of the sort that the black-capped chickadee can create and we can create. For many years following that discovery, we struggled to understand how the brain accomplishes this at the level of individual neurons and circuits. How can the brain create a trace that we can then relive without anything in the world coming in to remind us of that event? And along the way, as we try to answer that question, I think one of the most exciting discoveries has been that our definition of memory was probably quite a bit off to begin with. That's what happens when we are stuck using a brain to study the brain. And it turns out that our intuition about what it means to create a memory is not exactly how the brain solves it. This is another view of the hippocampus and of the organization of neurons in the hippocampus, showing you this unique structure it has and the different kinds of neurons that are in it. And what we've made great progress in is understanding how these neurons work together to create a snapshot in time. But along the way, some of the other things that the hippocampus does came to light and really forced us to reckon with the question of what memory is and what it is good for. Here's one thing we've discovered the hippocampus is really important for, and this is spatial navigation. So what you're seeing here, I don't know if I can show you the cursor, yeah. Here are paths that a rodent is making in a maze in this panel. And here what you're seeing are neurons, cells in the hippocampus that fire only when the rat is in a particular part of the maze. These are called place cells. So the structure that we know we need in order to create memories has cells in it that act kind of like a GPS. They tell us where we are in place, and they tell us where we are reliably. Turns out that there are neurons, cells in the hippocampus, that also do something very similar for time. So we have a single structure in the brain that is essential for creating memories that creates rich memories that we can relive as if we're re-entering a moment, and is also creating a map of space and essentially a map of time all at once. When we remove the hippocampus, we also learn that it is not just the creation of memories that is impaired, it is also the ability to imagine ourselves in a future. So I'd like to end before we move to the conversation in sharing this beautiful work of art by the artist Sarah Z. It's an installation that I think really captures beautifully the way we understand memory in the brain now, which is to say that we do have these individual snapshots, and what the brain does and what the hippocampus helps accomplish is a reorganization of those moments, of snapshots of our experiences throughout a lifetime in a complex structure that works a lot like a model, an understanding of the world, an inner model that organizes our experiences and does so in a way that makes it possible for us to imagine the future and to generate a sense of what is possible moving forward. And so with that, we move in space and time.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. Can everybody hear me? Yeah? So how do we begin to put these worlds together? It is true that in university structures, we study what we are sort of emotionally, psychologically, intuitively drawn to. And then as we go along and spend years and years studying, we actually become more and more structured by the way in which we've studied. So it's not innocent when we make a decision what we're going to pursue, because it actually affects the way that we develop our relationship to the world. So I've always thought that what we miss in the university structure is the bringing together of these different orientations to knowledge. And so this series is an attempt to bring people together who might normally not in public conversation. They might meet privately, but they wouldn't in public actually have this kind of conversation. And so it's my job to try to pull it together and make it make sense to you why they're here together. So I want to say first also that Zuckerman Institute, which Daphna is the director of, including all her own research in her own lab, has always understood that artists know things that they don't know. And they have created this amazing Kanzer program of artist in residence, writer in residence, and a jazz musician in residence every year. And Sarah Ruhl is the writer in residence this year because they know that artists know things that they might not know. And Freud knew this, and he's written about it quite a bit, where he says artists are always there first. They understood dreams first. They understood neurosis first. They understood obsession first. And then the scientists follow. So that's an important thing to understand from Freud. And one other thing. He also said, and this is for Sarah Ruhl, that the opposite of play is not serious occupation, but is reality. So the opposite of play is reality. So I'm just going to leave that all hanging. So I want to ask you both to begin, because I know that there's a real personal reason for each of you why memory is what you've studied. So Sarah, first with you. I know that you lost your father when you were 20 years old, and Eurydice is very much dedicated to him, but also about the relationship of fathers and daughters. So,
yeah, and what's kind of hitting me now is I lived 4 blocks from here when I came up with the idea for Eurydice. I remember I was walking down Broadway at about 122nd Street, and I was thinking, what if Eurydice said his name and he turned around? So it's surreal to be here 25 years later, or whatever it is. My father had cancer, and I was really close with him, and he died when I was 20, and I think I was drawn to the myth of Orpheus and Eurydice as a kind of container for that grief. And I don't, again, what you said about artists is true. We don't always know why we're doing what we're doing. I was young, and I just was drawn to the myth, and I just went towards it. I couldn't have explained why, but I think looking back, it was that I wanted to make sense of the afterlife. I wanted to have more conversations with my father. I wanted to remember what he taught me. And then I kind of developed this weird eschatology of the afterlife that was based on the Greeks, but was also kind of quixotic, this idea that you're dipped in the river of forgetfulness, which is in the Greek version. And then in my version, he can kind of remember a couple letters between the raindrops, and he remembers his daughter's name, the father. And so I thought, well, it stands to reason that Eurydice meets her father in the underworld, and that even though she's lost her memory, which means she's lost her identity, he can reteach her identity by teaching her language and therefore memory again. So the play is very much about the relationship between language, memory, and the bonds we have with people. And, you know, my father loved language and was very playful with language and used to teach me words. Once a week we'd go to this like pancake house in Chicago, and he'd teach me a difficult word and teach me the etymology. So there's a sequence in Eurydice that's based on those conversations.
But you make the play not about so much the love affair between Eurydice and Orpheus as the love affair between the daughter and the father.
I mean, I think it's a really twisted love triangle. I'm sure Freud would have plenty to say about that.
It's a beautiful passage where you talk about how the wedding is really the father giving away the daughter, but the end of the love affair of the daughter with the father, and she has to move on.
Well, I just think there's a reason we have all these rituals of leaving the nuclear family and going towards a new family. And I think it's because it's hard. And I think the Greeks knew that it was hard, and the Greeks knew that that journey was beset with peril. And so over and over again, people write these stories of a pretty simple journey, which is out of your familial home into making a new home. And it sort of never gets old to me.
So Daphna, so I said I was going to out you that you're writing this wonderful new book, which I've gotten to see a little bit of, and it's called Past as Prologue. And I learned from that book, or Past is Prologue, and I learned from that book about your sister. And so I don't know the sequence of your own fascination, obsession with memory and the hippocampus, but you tell us, how does that go? How did you become interested in memory?
All right, I'm gonna try and share things here that I haven't really shared with an audience. But let me start with something simpler, which is that when I was drawn initially to a graduate degree in PhD in neuroscience and particularly to learning and memory, the story as I understood it at the time was very much influenced by, for me, this fascination with change, that we change and how our experiences shape us. And I think that really came out of this experience I had growing up in many different cities and countries. And for those of you who've moved across, places, parts of the world, that change is striking, because the first time you do it, you realize that the world you grew up in is just one version of society, and you immediately see it didn't have to be that way. And you also immediately see, or at least I did, that I was different because I brought all these experiences from one way of living into a new way of living. And I think I became very obsessed with that early on, that recognition that somehow those changes that are making me who I am, making us as a society who we are, that are both local and kind of unique to us and to a group, the idea that is implemented in biology, that our experiences are creating this trace that's continuing, that really blew my mind when I was young, and still does. There's a really interesting twist here, in a sense, which is that when I decided to write a book. It was during COVID.
You're still having trouble saying that. It's actually
I am. Yes,
writing a book.
I am, and I am having trouble saying it, but there we go. And
I promise you, this audience is going to be very interested in this book.
it was during COVID, and I was about 15 years into running a lab, and I felt like I wanted a big, deep project of thought and writing. And I wanted to write. I want to take a sort of step back and think about what the lab has accomplished, what has the field accomplished in understanding these questions about memory. And that's all it was supposed to be. And when I wrote the book proposal, that's all that was there. And as I started writing the book, this very personal story wouldn't let go, wouldn't move out of the way. And I didn't want to write about it. But I did, and it's interesting. It reminds me a little bit of your reflection sitting here now. There's sort of ways in which we don't know ourselves, and what happened is I was in the middle of graduate school, really kind of smack in the middle of my PhD, when my sister had a car accident and suffered brain damage. And we were very, very close. I arrived at the hospital, and I have this very vivid memory of the physician showing me a scan of her brain, the same kind of scans I had been viewing as a graduate student. And we were listening vaguely to the doctor describe the damage, and simultaneously thinking, oh, I'm not going to finish a PhD in neuroscience. I'm going to have to figure out something else to do with the rest of my life because I won't be able to. This is just too painful. She did not survive. She died. And I did come back to the lab, and I found the opposite, that the science gave life meaning and continuity and pulled me forward. And until I started writing the book, did not connect the idea that I had really kind of been figuring out how to build a life with this loss and memory. And the answer to how to build that life was the science of memory. And I as I started writing, just thought, oh, duh. Yeah, there you go.
But you talk in the chapters I've read so far, you talk about the orderliness of science, that it was really comforting to you. There was an elegance to the order. And you, Sarah, you talk about that too in the questions at the end. Oh, this is a beautiful edition of Eurydice, if you want a copy, and has beautiful question answers at the end. But you talk about how the play helped you, or made you understand the relation to your father, or furthered your own grief about your father.
Well, I think there's something about grief and repetition, and I think, I remember the first time I did a reading of Eurydice, I was maybe 27 at a place called New Dramatists in New York, and I thought, ugh, why did I share this with an audience? I feel terrible and vulnerable. I hate it. It's too raw. I feel too exposed. And I ran to the bathroom, sobbed. I wouldn't come out. I didn't want to greet anyone. And then through repetition, the story got assimilated and became easier to talk about, and became, every time I saw the play, it was like another funeral for my father. And if you have that many funerals, you get
a nerd to it.
Yeah, you let your grief go eventually. And so by the time it was an opera, I was sort of felt like, oh, the grief now belongs to my collaborators, to the composer, Matthew O'Coin, to these younger people who are now working on it. So it was therapeutic.
But it's so interesting to me because the disciplines of being a writer or being an artist, creating form, and being a scientist look so different from the outside. But obviously, there is a way in which giving something structure really allows you to move beyond that. I know that from my attempts at writing memoir, that it's because I created a container for all of this that I was able to move beyond certain issues as well, grief. But you also say in this questions in the back, which I'm a big advocate now for this question answer format for a writer, I think it's great, that the play gave you a way to have more conversations with your father. But then you say now the grief in this play belongs to other people, those who read or embody the play. And I thought that was so wonderful because this goes to the notion of embodiment, which you talked about earlier. Like, is the audience of the play able, like the actors, to embody the emotion, and in that embodying, to perhaps move beyond themselves, which of course the Greeks believed, because you could have this tragedy and you could go through these really horrific experiences and somehow leave feeling much cleaner. But when you talk about embodiment for yourself and recognizing you could not embody your own language of your own play when you were forced to be an actor, and what kind of a new appreciation even for what actors do, what about the audience?
I love that question. I mean, I feel like that's profound, and I do think
It's obvious.
Well, I do think the Greeks knew something about catharsis, and I do think giving the audience the ability to cry, to feel fear and pity for people who are not themselves, but who might resemble themselves in a way, but who have enough abstraction that they can project their own memories, their own experiences onto the figure. I mean, you need the audience. I mean, and I write some poetry too, and with my poems, like, it's nice if someone else reads them. I enjoy that, but it's not essential. It's not why I write the poem. But for a play, it does feel kind of like a useless, limp piece of lettuce that's been left in a refrigerator if it doesn't see an audience. You really need the audience to imbibe it, to keep it alive.
So Daphna, talk about embodied memory. Like, we know from Proust and other writers, I mean, memory is connected to the senses so directly. Like, you smell something, you hear something, you taste something, the air is a certain way, and everything comes flooding in. How does the brain do that?
Yeah, I think, I think that experience is so one of those things, we've all had that experience so many times, and yet understanding the mystery of how it happens, we haven't fully figured it out yet. And before I get to that, I want to touch on something that Sarah said and that you alluded to earlier, which I hadn't really thought of before, that has to do with kind of going from the particular. I think that's also really related to this question of embodiment. Like, our memories are so particular, and we were just talking back there about this book, I Remember, by Joe Brainard. I don't know, some of you may know it. The whole book is sort of a recollection of very specific details that are his life. So there's something extremely specific and particular about memory of the sort, these episodic memories. And there's something so particular about grief, and yet there's nothing more universal. And I think, to me, that has been a big part of the story of both scientifically, how do we discover sort of general universal truths about memory and its creation when the function it serves is so very particular, right? I think about, Dimitri, my colleague, who's studying how a bird solves the problem of memory in a brain that's different from ours. So there are these general scientific truths that are what we're seeking as scientists, while what we're trying to understand is sort of this very particular embodied reality of a given memory. So to me, that and we're not there, right? So we don't know yet, right? We're still really at the broader universal truth-seeking level. I think what's so to provide maybe give a simpler answer to your question, I mean, what we know is that the brain is constantly processing sensory input, and it's doing something. And we have a lot of automatic retrieval. So the hippocampus, which I already mentioned, sits in some sense at the top of a hierarchy of sensory processing. So it kind of gets all this input and sends all this output back. And it means that the crumb of a cookie can lead to the memory of the Madeleine, can lead to the memory of a childhood. And so that kind of structure of I think of it as almost pulling on a yarn. One thing pulls on the other, and memories come out. Often you didn't even know you had them, like where you were when you thought of the play.
So can you talk about this navigational ability of the brain? Like you talked about the chickadee and confined, all of these things. I mean, how do humans do that? I mean, it's so complicated, right? And you talk about the capacity to, in this writing that you're doing, you talk about the capacity to understand the past, to locate the present, and then even to imagine the future. So there's a mapping that goes on. So can you know so much about that, can you just?
Yeah, so I think, when place cells, the ones I mentioned that were discovered, these sort of cells in the hippocampus that indicate where you are in space, it led to this sort of split in the field. It seems silly now, but there were people who sort of thought, no, that studied the hippocampus and spatial navigation as if it had nothing to do with memory, and people who studied the hippocampus and memory as if it had nothing to do with spatial navigation. I think really until quite recently there was this mystery, and there still are some people who argue it's space first and memory hijacked space. No, it's memory first. Space hijacked memory. And I think that just like the nature-nurture question, which doesn't have a one or the other answer, the answer is this, it's this wonderful term that a couple of colleagues, Howard Eichenbaum and Neil Cohen, came up with. They said that what the hippocampus does is relational encoding. It's not space or memory. It's sort of a structuring of associations based on the relationship between them. And that when we are looking out into space, space is relational. Time is relational. And it's the binding together of the input about space and time and creating the connection between them that is the remarkable thing that the hippocampus, together with other parts of the brain, is doing. It's sort of this stamping in of all these different threads of our experiences.
Sarah, in Eurydice, when Eurydice goes into the underworld, she's completely disoriented. And the first thing that she loses is language. Mm-hmm. And that's really very similar to the she can't navigate space, and she can't navigate language. And the stones tell her, you can't talk like that here. Mm-hmm. All of those references don't work here. And it's almost as if you were writing about an amnesiac or someone with a disorder, sort of hippocampus disorder, who can't navigate. So this is this thing that Freud, the writers, artists, I know, you won't know why you did that necessarily, but just talk about it.
Yeah, it's sometimes good to just pretend to be an oracle and say, oh, yes, I did that.
You knew it.
Oh,
you knew that.
Yeah.
But it's so interesting because if I read Daphna and then I read the play, I think, well, that's exactly what you're talking about, only you did it in this dramatic
Yeah, they're
way.
totally in conversation with each other, and the play has a kind of dream logic, like almost like when you arrive somewhere in a dream or in another country. I mean, I guess I was thinking about travel and being disoriented in other countries when you don't know the language, or a kind of nightmare where you don't feel located. And I do think there is something about language that helps us feel located, and the web of relations that we have that make us feel located, which is why it's so hard to say goodbye to our families. And in so many myths, your family meets you in the afterlife, and I think that makes a kind of sense. But what you're saying is so fascinating to me, and guess I'll never call anyone a bird brain again, because my God, I don't think I ever have actually, but I would never.
So one of the things you talk about, Daphna, is, I've heard so many parents who say, well, I don't know if my child should be brought up bilingual because they'll just get confused. But you talk about these roadmaps and how someone who has two unique different contexts, like language or two homes. Well, you talk about it.
Yeah, so there's really fascinating work on bilingualism. A topic I am bilingual, but I'm no expert on the science of it. But one of the really interesting things to come out of that work is that when people are raised bilingual from a young age, they have some short-term language delays, perhaps, but they basically develop the ability not just to speak two languages, but actually they're better at switching in general. They develop this sort of meta-cognitive capacity to switch between the languages, because when both languages are native to their experience and to their brain. And in this part of the draft of the book that I'm trying to write, that I shared with Carol, I write about the connection between space and between home, and this concept of home and what it means to be at home and what it means to not be at home. And I've moved so many times in my life that really, now I think New York City is the only place that really feels like home. And about the ability of the brain to construct these maps of places, and that the idea that maybe there's some parallel to this bilingualism for people who have more than one home, that you are able to construct multiple places that feel like home and move between them. And I've always kind of wondered if that's something that I really think so many New Yorkers probably feel that is something they identify with. I would hope, I would imagine.
And what's that situation where some people will have a stroke, but they can revert to another language? Like they have memory loss in one language, but not another. Doesn't that happen occasionally?
Yeah, it happens with stroke. It happens with dementia. That people sort of, as they lose memory. Just yesterday, a friend called me to share about her aunt who has Alzheimer's disease, is reverting back to her mother tongue, and it's fascinating.
So how does that work? I mean, is one language in one place and the other in another place?
One of the things that's interesting about the bilingualism is that no, they're sort of embedded, but unless people learn the languages simultaneously during early development, then yes, then you can sort of, there studies people have shown that they're sort of localized elsewhere, and it's really a memory question, right? So I have an uncle who had a stroke who reverts to Hungarian now, and the cue is clearly not in Hungarian, but what it's retrieving from memory is something that's misaligned.
You say, I'm going to quote you here from your chapters, you say some minds learn to rely on a single familiar map, others learn to hold more than one, shifting between frameworks as contexts change. And then you say the maps we carry are not fixed and they are not neutral, but they are powerful precisely because they provide us with a structure, a model that help us move forward in a world that is always changing. So we come back to this notion of structure, and yet when you show us these images, they're like Sarah Z's, there's Sarah Z's installation, which is that they're very dispersed kinds of structures, and
yeah, somehow they have to be both things at once, which I think is exactly, what we have in our minds, right? And we, when there's utter confusion and lack of structure, we see what that looks like with dementia. But I think in the there's no way around needing that structure in order to make predictions to think about what might happen, to know, like I know right now, what's behind that door. There has to be some kind of sense of order. And I think there is this challenge we have or this tension between the fact that our minds want to resolve everything into something as orderly as possible that gives us the most certainty, but also the world itself is full of uncertainty and complexity. And I think that's where context really matters, and why it matters so much for memory, right? Because rather than keeping in mind everything in memory all at once and accessing it, if you ask me where the restroom is, I won't accidentally tell you where it is relative to my apartment. I know where it is relative to here because I have I have incoming sensation and vision telling me what the context is right now, which kind of constrains what I'm able to, the model I'm using at the moment in some sense.
So in Eurydice, it's so interesting to me that hell, or the underworld, is a place where you don't have language, and where you don't have memory, and where you can't make connections between things, and where you forget everything that ever mattered to you. That is a kind of hell, and if anyone who's been around people who have that experience understand that it's a really difficult place.
And I guess as a writer, I probably thought, what would hell be to me, not having language? But also, I think there was a kind of grace that I was trying to get at, or a neutrality, I guess, maybe is a better word than grace. The idea that there could be a grace in forgetting, or there could be a kind of compassion in not being attached to your memories forever and ever, and wanting to recreate them and wanting to have the people back. That there was, it's a little bit like a bardo state.
Then I have a question for both of you following from that one. If one doesn't remember one's own history, then one would not remember suffering or pain. How then could you have empathy?
And how could you learn and have wisdom? One thing we talked about early on with your research that I found so fascinating was this amazing stuff you all are doing with finding where memories are in mice and maybe erasing them or changing them. And then we talked about re-narrativizing memory as you go back. That just fascinates me.
Yeah, I think, something worth mentioning in both contexts is that we don't remember in one way. So I've been talking until now about this experience we have when we talk about remembering, and when Joe Brainerd writes his book, and we're talking about access to these rich, consciously aware worlds and memories, but that's really just one form of memory. So a very important discovery of modern-ish neuroscience is there's a lot we know that we don't know we know all the time. And as you were asking your question, I was thinking about the film Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, which is both a wonderful film and a really clever kind of science fiction meditation on memory. And to me, part of what the point that film makes is that even when you remove the episodic memories, like the trace of how we, relying on the frozen pond as they are in the film, that they're still drawn to one another in this beautiful romantic story. And so I don't know how deliberate it was, but the film really makes the point that you can lose access to a particular memory, but its impact on who you are, or its reflection of who you are, can remain.
Do you ever, in the conversations in science, talk about collective memory? Because we move, we move in society with collective trauma, and we move with collective memory, which we acknowledge or don't acknowledge, or even genetic memory, or how are things carried from generation to generation. Is there any way to look at that?
Yeah, there have been attempts. I'd say it's I think where we are, we're behind where everyone would want us to be and where we are too. So we've never known as much as we know today, but in some sense, when we bring science and art together, what always strikes me is like it's like we haven't gotten to the most interesting answers yet. The questions are there, but so people have tried to, there have been studies of collective memory. There's quite a bit that's understood of collective memory kind of, from sociology. And there have been interesting attempts to provide answers at the level of brains. And the last chapter of the book, which I haven't shared with you yet, goes into
I'll wait for it. When I was starting to think about writing memoir, I talked to Orhan Pamuk, who is on our faculty at the School of the Arts, Nobel laureate, and I said, Orhan, how? Because I had read stories where he could reconstruct card games that he played with his brother. He could actually give the exact hand in terms of numbers, the games they were playing, as if they happened yesterday. And I said, how do you do that? And he said, if you go back to your childhood or wherever you want to be, you will remember everything. And I realized that that was true, that if I went back into the room or into the apartment where I grew up, I could see everything. And I think everyone in this room, pretty much, if they tried to reconstruct the room of their childhood or the apartment or the house, would see everything. How is that even imaginable? Because what that says is that memory is timeless. That sometimes the memory of childhood is more powerful than what happened yesterday. And we remember it better, especially if there's trauma, right?
Well, in our dream lives, too, we can reconstruct those places, or at least I can with absolute accuracy. I dream of those houses all the time. And my daughter, I remember one school assignment she had was to visually make a painting of her, of somewhere that she knew well, and she did her grandmother's apartment, and it was kind of staggering to me at her age, the detail she had, a photograph in the corner, this raggedy chair, she said, in the kitchen. It was all mapped. And words fail me, but what you study and the sort of images that were on the wall of those beautiful, what was the beautiful rainbow tendrils?
That was a staining of individual neurons.
So they're
showing kind
not
of a
like
slice through
rainbow
the hippocampus.
colored in your
No,
brain.
it's a staining technique. That would be so nice, but they can be in your next play.
There you go.
But I have to say something that I don't want to be the, but it's important. I don't. The memories come back to us. I can't remember the word you used now, because my memory is failing me. I think you said something accurately or vividly, but it's with the illusion of accuracy. And it's like I really don't. I know. So I think it's worth emphasizing though, because there's the quality of these episodic memories is very, very vivid, and we construct them in a way that gives us that feeling. But we know, without a doubt, that certainty and vividness is sometimes accurate and sometimes not.
Right.
Or recreated from a photograph or a painting. I mean, I wonder if people's memory maps will change now that lived experience is always mediated through visual representation as it happens. I mean, kids are constantly doing a thing, then taking a picture of a thing, looking at the memory of the thing. I don't know.
Yeah, it's an interesting experiment. Unfortunately, all our children are living through guinea pigs, and but I think we know how to create false memories, and people often are alarmed to hear that as if it's a bad thing. But I do think from the artistic point of view, it's actually rather beautiful.
Wait, let's go back. We know how
Okay.
to create false memories. How do we do that? What is that?
Yeah, so there have been these experiments. It goes back to the 70s. This woman, Elizabeth Loftus, who's controversial in all kinds of interesting ways that probably aren't relevant to today's discussion. But She was the first to really document in experiments how easy it is to create false memories. And basically, she would show people a movie and then ask them questions about it. And quite a few people would insert information from the questions into their memory. She'd bring them back and ask them later. So, if I were to, now say to everyone, remember when you were walking into the building, there was someone giving out, I don't know, bananas, which was probably the worst possible experimental idea to come up with. Some of you might, might incorporate that into your memory, not today, but if I did it again and then I asked you next week, as the accuracy, as forgetting kicks in, these details get incorporated.
Right.
And so we collect, like the Sarah Z installation, we collect pieces of our experiences and connect them.
Yeah. I had a wonderful teacher, Mac Wellman, a playwright, who used to say, it's amazing, people will come to my play and they'll say, I loved the duck. And I'll say, there was no duck. Like such people sort of imagine.
When I was writing the first memoir, I'd written it and I sent it to a cousin of mine who's older. And she said, what you said about our grandmother and your memory of her death, that's wrong. And she's 5 years older. And I thought, you know what? I'm sticking to my story. I mean, I'm not rewriting that. That's how I remember it. And of course she was older and she's probably correct. But my whole, not just the memory of that moment, but everything, the whole gestalt of the space is pivoted around that memory. I don't know what it would be like pulling a thread out of your sweater and the whole thing starts to undo. So I can see what you're saying is you get very committed to a version of reality. Well, let's see what you want to hear what the audience wants to hear? Okay. The current attack on attention from phones and screens, is that likely to have an effect on memory?
Yes. One could say more, but so here's at the fundamental level, how we attend to the world is going to impact what we remember, both when we're encoding, right? If you're not listening to what we're saying, there's no way you're going to remember it, but also so much of what we remember is determined not in the moment of the experience, but events that happen after the fact. And that is true both at the level of our experiences. What you do later tonight, what you'll do tomorrow will impact your memory of this conversation. But also there are correlates of that in terms of neural and things happening in the brain. So the memory you'll create of a moment of this evening isn't fully created now when it's done. There's something that's sort of softly created now and it gets revisited, and proteins, need to move. And so there's it's actually a very protracted process of creating long-term memories. And that means that it's not just the attention at the moment in terms of distraction of the phone, but also kind of how you're going to attend to things later on that can go back and change the likelihood of a memory surviving.
Have they studied, for example, like facial recognition and memory on Zoom? Like, I can't remember I'm very good at remembering faces, but on Zoom, if I meet someone on Zoom, I don't remember their face. Like, why is that?
Yeah, I don't know if someone studied that or not, but I think it makes perfect sense given what we already know, which is memories are bound in time and space and context, and Zoom flattens all that to nearly, to something that's so impoverished relative to the real world.
But also when we meet people, we take in an enormous amount of information from their physical self, which is not conscious, but we like people, we don't like them almost instantly. Maybe the way they smell, or the way they look at you, but whatever that information is, you don't get that when you have this flattened image, which is why it's so exhausting in part, because the same thing that feeds energy, which is being with other humans, that doesn't happen on Zoom. So you get really tired after talking to people. Whereas when you're with people, their energy, this is not scientific in any way, obviously, but it's the way certainly I experience the world. you know, people either give you a lot of energy with their presence, or they take energy from you with their presence. But when I was the dean, Brian's laughing, but when I was the dean, I would sit in my office sometimes, and somebody would be there for a half hour, and they would leave, and I would fall asleep. And I would feel like it was like, it wasn't you, I would feel like it was Invasion of the Body Snatchers, like they had just drained my energy completely, and then somebody else would come in, and they would be so bright, and that would buoy up my energy. So I think when in Zoom, none of this happens. I mean, people also aren't ever funny on Zoom.
But I'll say, in the same vein, but the
Not
flip
playful.
side,
Not playful. Sorry.
the difference between a Zoom conversation with people for whom you do have a rich memory
Yes.
versus not, right?
Yes.
I think, you're talking about sort of the creation of the memory, but I felt that the Zoom meetings and conversations, when there was a family member I hadn't seen in 2 months, they had all the richness of an interaction, because seeing
You
their
brought
face,
them.
I
You
had
brought
a
them.
model for
Yeah.
what all that every smile means. And when you're meeting someone without those memories, there's really not, very little there.
Okay, when you talk about navigational skills, that must be you, Daphna, I think about how I use my brain to navigate less and less as I become more reliant on my smartphone to tell me where to go and what to think. Is the smartphone like the river in Emerita? Is it the river Lethe? Does it cause us to lose brain power and memory?
I'm really making myself unpopular here today. I think yes and no. We navigate whether we're using the phone or not, right? So our brains have evolved to do this, and there's no way to shut it off. But I think of it more. So it's less that we're like. It's less. I would think of it less a weakening of a muscle and more the former question, the attention. It's that we're just not actually attending to the world in the same way because our heads are down instead of up. So we're missing a lot of cues that we would normally be using, and that richness, I think, is probably impoverished.
So here's a question about grief and memory. Sometimes people are stuck in grief for longer periods of time. Is it connected to memory? I can't read what the next sentence is here. Is there any cooperation between neuroscience and psychiatry? Oh, yeah.
Yes, yes, there's a lot of important collaboration between psychiatry and neuroscience and psychology and and questions about mental health and trauma and are very much on the forefront of people's minds more than ever, and the fields are interconnected more than ever before. Partly thanks to changes in the tools available, partly thanks to changes and advances in each of the disciplines independently. And I think it really, psychiatrists will say that PTSD more generally, in addition to sort of, trauma related to grief, is very much about kind of pathologically persistent memory. And that understanding how memory works can help us understand better how to treat that. And I think what you said earlier, Sarah, is so consistent with, and you have, a psychiatrist, I hear, this idea of sort of exposure therapy and repeating the story. And
Right, my husband is a psychiatrist. He's not here tonight, but I wish he were. I also had a thought just about narrative and language and trauma, and putting language to memory as a kind of therapy. I was just thinking about you writing this book and this, horrible loss you had of your sister, and how you paused for a second and said, I don't usually talk about this in front of an audience, which is really hard. And I remember when I wrote this memoir, Smile, which was about, I had paralysis on my face after giving birth to twins, and, it persisted. Usually it's a quick thing. and for me, it just persisted and persisted. So anyway, I wrote this book about the experience. But when I first had to talk about it in public, writing about it was okay. But when people would ask me about it, my mind would just go blank. They would say, well, when did you get the diagnosis? What happened? Can you take me back? And I would be like, well, I had the twins, a lactation consultant came, and I looked in the mirror, and I just wouldn't be able to sort of continue narrativizing about it. But then I had to practice. I had to go out and talk about it over and over and over again. And I think it helped me assimilate the memory. And it was less of a moment where you're, walking along the ice of your life and you just fall into a hole. And it became more integrated into my life.
So interesting. So I see some colleagues here who will know this story, but it's very relevant. We have one of the scientists at our Neuroscience Institute, Vikram Gadekar, who studies a different kind of bird, songbirds, and who wrote this beautiful paper about a year ago about the difference in the bird's brain when it's learning to sing and when it's performing the song, and what happens when it makes a mistake during learning or during the performance. And it's this.
Incredible.
Do birds make mistakes in performing? No, seriously. I mean, it
Yeah,
seems like
there's
they have a few notes they repeat over.
So these songbirds are really sophisticated. It's their language, and in fact, many people are studying the neuroscience of birdsong as a kind of analogy to language. So some birds, these songbirds, have very complex songs, and they learn them. They're not born with that knowledge. They learn it from a tutor. And
tutor?
A tutor, which is usually a parent.
Oh, it's their parent.
But it doesn't have to be a parent. But the learning involves mistakes. Not, and the thought is that in fact that's as it should be, in the sense that the variability as they create the song is important to help them shape it to be the song it needs to be, for the ultimate goal, which is of course to impress a mate.
Is that the only goal? That's it. That's it.
For the birds, that's the survival. We might learn language. We might use language in more complicated ways. We might not.
So I think we may have already we talked about this a little bit, but can you discuss intentional forgetting of traumatic memory and the neuroscience behind new treatments for PTSD that enable people to let go, overcome, or cope with traumatic memories that constantly haunt or intrude on the present, which must be a horrible thing to live with every day. Yeah.
I'm not sure I have much more to say about that than I already did, except that I think what we haven't said here and is worth saying is just on the importance of forgetting. Right? We always talk about memory as if the more we remember, the better, but there are things we're better off not remembering, and our brain most of the time gets rid of those memories pretty easily, and sometimes does not.
And this is a non-scientific recommendation, but the book, A Primer for Forgetting, by Lewis Hyde, is quite wonderful. And he talks about all kinds of unexpected benefits of forgetting.
So the memories that haunt people, the ones that you can't get rid of, that keep coming back, where are they in the brain?
The thought is that a lot of this experience of persistent memories in PTSD, for example, that things that are related to the memory, but also many things that are unrelated to memory, the way they trigger the persistent haunting memory is through the hippocampus. So it's basically that same mechanism of the Madeleine, but in a way where now everything is a reminder of the haunting memory. So it's yet another example, as of many of the ways in which sort of otherwise healthy adaptive mechanisms that help us remember our worlds go awry in trauma and disease and so forth.
So this is my question to you. Where is the imagination?
Yeah, I think to me the link between thinking about the future and imagining and memory, which is a relatively new the agreement that those are so tightly connected is relatively new. And so, and it turns out there were hints all along, but it was really about 10 years ago, I think, that the first studies showed scientifically that people who have damage to the hippocampus, who we knew for decades lose the ability to create episodic memories, they also cannot imagine future events. So you ask them, you know, if I asked you, remember your birthday 1 year ago, and then now imagine your birthday in 1 year, they can't. And they can tell you, well, it will be happy, or they can give you some general descriptions. But without the hippocampus, they are unable to furnish these sort of rich memories that most of us can come up with relatively easily. And I think, you know, I've thought a lot about what that means for what memory is for, but I think it really also says a lot about how imagination works, this idea that we construct. We construct what feel like memories from the past, and it's the same kind of machinery that helps us construct things in the future, and it's all sort of this creative recombining of things we've created, we encode, and in new and creative ways.
Because it strikes me, I mean, you know, we are in an art school, and they're not valued to a great extent, and yet art schools are places that believe in, are committed to the imagination. Whereas there's really not much in the culture that is, you know? And yet, were we not to have imagination, were that to disappear, we would not be able to envision anything that doesn't already exist. So I've never understood why, as a species, we don't value that as the most important thing. I mean, you can't answer that. I know it's just a philosophical dilemma. But
I think it's a really important point. I think it comes down a little bit to some, you know, this sort of using our brain to study the brain and the illusion that we have, right? Our universities are structured in some sense around what feel to us intuitive separations between disciplines. And then it really comes down to this connection, you know, you and I care so much about between science and art, and having these kind of conversations. The idea that art is about imagination and other things are not, as if imagining something that is possible is separate from remembering something that was. And I think the brain is telling us that distinction is something we've invented, and that fundamentally there's a connection between holding on to the past and imagining a possible future. So
it's just that there's this devotion in art-making environments in general to the development of subjectivity and the individual, which is very different than a lot of other disciplines, which have bodies of knowledge that they're transmitting from one generation to the next. But places where people are creating in multiple forms, it's not that other disciplines don't have imagination. You couldn't do anything in neuroscience if you didn't all think to the future. But you would never say that your mission is to develop the individual creativity and imagination of each of the scientists in every lab. You know what I mean? It's an orientation to the world, and I'm always shocked that as a species we just simply don't value that more. Why don't we value? But that's just a philosophical question. I'm moving on. Okay, are we remembering forward? The question. Oh, here we go. If we are seekers of structure, how do we innovate, create new art? I guess the question is really where is that in the brain? I don't know if you can answer that question. But
can you repeat the question?
Yeah, are we remembering forward, question mark. If we are seekers of structure, how do we innovate, create new art? We are seekers of structure.
That's profound. I mean, yeah. I mean, I can say one thing just from a playwriting perspective, which is that there are a million structures for a play, but often we're taught that there's only one structure, an Aristotelian arc, and you know, it sort of follows like a male orgasm. It's like, and then it goes up and then it goes down. and then you can imagine, different forms, different concentric circles, and my teacher, Paula Vogel, who is a great formalist and is really interested in Russian formalism, would teach that there were 6 platforms at least, and then she would enumerate them. There's pattern plays, there's repetition, there's plays that go backwards, and then there's the ability of every playwright to invent their own structure, and you could draw it and it could look like a vase or a squiggly line. It might not look like an arc, but that's sort of the received wisdom. That is a story structure. But just in terms of what you're saying about received bodies of knowledge too, I think it's really good to have legacy and receive what Aristotle was giving us. But also Aristotle didn't write plays, he just described what he saw. So to imagine new worlds, to imagine the structure for new experiences, to create how those experiences might move through time and space, which is what a play is and why it's so bedeviling sometimes. It's ongoing, and isn't it magnificent that people still want to do it? And how incredible. It's such an ancient art form, and you'd think by now with our phones and our this and our that no one would want to be a playwright anymore.
It's so lucrative.
And yet they just keep marching forward. They keep wanting to create these new forms.
Well, maybe now when science is losing all its funding, we can all learn how to write some plays.
Well, I thought at one point with the arts losing all of their funding that we should go to the NIH and say, look, playwriting and theater is a salve for the human epidemic of loneliness. So can we get some money for the loneliness epidemic? But now...
I think we should collaborate.
Okay, so what does Proust know about memory that science will never know?
Wow, like knowing what we will never know. I think we'll figure it out. Just give us some time.
I can say one thing about that, which was in my time here at the lab, I was so moved to speak with one of maybe she's a postdoc, I'm not sure, she's working in one of the labs, and she was talking about the Madeleines, and she started to weep talking about that passage and how much it meant to her in terms of what literature can do in describing memory. And then she was talking about Nabokov and Speak Memory and how much it meant to her. And I think, wow, scientists are sometimes better read than writers. But B, it just made me think how beautiful that that literature was continuing to animate her sense of mission around the study of this.
I don't know who that is, and it is a moving story, and I think to me that's why these conversations are so important, because we're scientists who are trying to understand the mind and brain, and so many people have personal stories. Come in, the younger they are, the more about something really profound that got them interested in this field, and then sometimes the field tries to beat it out of them. Like, no, focus on the structure of the cell, which is so important for the discovery that I think what I want is for everybody to be able to keep that in mind all at once. So it's a great story.
This question about Proust, what does Proust know about memory that science will never know? There's something hostile in that question, and I really don't think we need to be, because that's the wonderful thing about this multiplicity of the need of humans to create so many kinds of forms within which to understand the world, and to understand ourselves. So I don't think there really has to be an either or in this question. You're so much of what you and neuroscience will help us all with are these disorders that are plaguing so many people that we need to understand how one might address them. Proust wouldn't know how to do that. He never got out of bed, basically. He was busy writing, but he knows an enormous amount of the complexity of metaphor and image and symbolism and how one creates the most complex, the most elaborate structures, sort of the height of it all in terms of creativity, but he could never understand what the potential of what you all can and have and will continue to be able to help people to deal with. So I'm not into hostile questions, whoever wrote that question. Okay, let's see if I can understand this. Daphna has talked in the past about the beholder's share, about abstract art relying on personal experiences, memory, and viewers. What do Daphna and Sarah think about how non-abstract art can let the audience in? How can artists better evoke the viewer's personal experience, memory, whether consciously or subconsciously?
Wow, that's
Just
an
take any piece of
interesting
it,
question.
any
Yeah.
piece.
Okay. So I'll give like a one-sentence recap for those of you who haven't read all my papers. I had this really wonderful collaborative project with Eric Kandel, one of the founders of the Institute, who was really interested in understanding how abstract art can elicit more imagination potentially than representational or concrete art, except he studied sea slugs and mice, and it was very hard to ask that question. And so I collaborated so we could ask this question in humans. And several years later, we found that, in fact, there's evidence for that in the brain. There's something kind of special about abstract art that leaves more openness in interpretation. And I think, I actually think that the Proustian Madeleine is helpful here because as this book I mentioned earlier, which I meant to bring out here to show, but kind of show and tell, which is Joe Brainerd's I Remember, that concrete details are very powerful for memory. So they make it easier, but in fact they make it impossible almost not to retrieve memories. And so if I say happiness, I don't know what comes to your mind, but if I say I was happy standing at the beach with my 12-year-old daughter on a sunny day in Costa Rica, you're probably getting more out of your own memory retrieval. And so I think, I don't know if that speaks at all to the creation of worlds.
It's fascinating to me, and I want to read the papers. And I just recently went to the Rothko Chapel in Houston, and I hadn't been there, and I love Rothko, and I'd always wanted to go. And if you don't know, it's configured with these very dark canvases that are almost black, and they're quite moving. And Rothko would talk about wanting to create an experience of art rather than a representation. And I guess for me, how it functions in playwriting, again, you go back to embodiment because you always have an actor's body, you don't just have a canvas. And so for me, it ends up being about having a slight abstraction in the characters so that the audience can project themselves into this other body. So if you look at realism, naturalism in the theater, like Ibsen, Hedda Gabler becomes very individuated. She's at the sort of fulcrum where naturalism began. And for me, I'm fascinated by the play Hedda Gabler. It doesn't move me actually that much. And what moves me in theater are stories where there's just enough abstraction that I can lean forward and the actor is like an avatar for my imagination. And there's something for me about realism that closes off that circuitry a little bit.
So one very practical question, because we have to end, I know. So this is a question for Dr. Shohamy. You talked about how you chose to study neuroscience and memory in graduate school. And do you have any advice for undergrads who are unsure if neuroscience is the right path or major for them?
I love this question. I get it all the time, and I love answering it. And I'm going to try to keep it really short for those of you who are not asking that question. But just try it. Find a lab, get some experience, see how it feels. You can't go wrong. That's my advice.
So I want to thank Gavin Browning for helping us organize this. I want to thank the fantastic Lenfest team. I want to thank Dean Sarah Cole, who is here tonight as well. And I want to thank you all for being a fantastic audience. So thank you. Oh, and there are books. There are books.